finally getting down to it, the Elf Pantheon. To a lot of the other races of the old world, the elves have a pretty different pantheon. What makes it differently is that their gods, for the most part, weren't at one point large figureheads in their society. Dwarf ancestor gods, Grungi, Grimnir, Valaya, were all at one time actual dwarfs. Or Sigmar was a human tribesman that actually helped fight off a massive horde of greenskins and chaos, and really helped unite the clans, unite the tribesmen of Empire to create the Empire. He was the first emperor. But the elves have a more spiritual pantheon, and that's not to say that the humans and dwarves don't, as they have a bevy of other gods and aspects, but the elf pantheon is definitely regarded with far more mysticism, even though some aspects are shared with across pantheons. Like Cain in the elf pantheon is also Cain in the human pantheon. And there's a lot of people that say Cain is also like corn. Or there's Kurnous, which is a lot like Tal in the human pantheon. So there's a lot of similarities, or I mean even Lileath, who's the Lady of the Lake, but we'll get to those. But the elvish pantheon is referred to as the Pantheonic Mandala. Mandala, or M-A-N-D-A-L-A, however you want to say that. And it is a wheel with the elf's respective patron god in the center. The inner circle is then reserved for gods that the elf favors, with the outermost are for the gods that are disapproved. So in the example here of the high elves, we have Asuryan in the very center, the inner ring being the Kadai, the ones that mostly fall in line with the high elves' beliefs and moral system. And the outermost ring is reserved for the Cytharai, or Cytharai, whichever one you want to pronounce that. It's C-Y-T-H-A-R-A-I. Or really, there's just the gods that are generally disapproved of. And we can see from each of these pantheonic mandalas that the high elves, dark elves, and wood elves, that there is a different god in the center. The high elves are Asuryan, the dark elves have Cain, the wood elves have both Kurnous and Isha. So we've spoken a little now about the Kadai and the Cytharai, but who are they? What do those words really even mean? Well, the Kadai are the gods that dwell in the heavens alongside Asuryan, and these represent rather kind of benevolent and amiable traits of the high elves, such as crafting, hunting, farming, motherhood, the typical fare of gods. And these large temples, priesthoods, and shrines are dedicated to the Kadai throughout all of elfdom, and elfdom in this case being mainly Ulthuan. Even lands in the Empire that the elves inhabit have small shrines, especially in Marienburg, where a lot of sea elves landed over time, and Marienburg being kind of like a boiling pot of a lot of different cultures, the sea elves landing in there. But these are the gods that the high and the wood elves predominantly worship. Dark elves, though, not so much. The Cytharai, on the other hand, rule over Mirai, M-I-R-A-I, or the underworld. The wood elves and high elves tend to pick and choose only choice ones from this list, rather than the entire group. Small shrines here and there, maybe a few individual worshippers, but it isn't necessarily encouraged, and in fact it's either illegal or greatly frowned upon, depending on who you're worshipping from this realm. The dark elves, though, those S&M bastards, worship all of the Cytharai, loud and proud. So just like the high elves and wood elves worship the Kadai, they practice that same level of overtness, especially to Cain, their patron god. So there are some exceptions that exist, though. MacLeod is heavily worshipped above all by the mariners of both races, the Blackguard Corsairs, Lothern Seaguard, Ivris, and Gothic mariners, etc. Morai Heg falls in between both worlds, so she is a bit of a neutral god, as much as you can have in the elf pantheon. So as we were saying, the dwarf gods and Sigmar actually walk the world. With the elf pantheon, it's not that way. Mainly it's more of a hearsay, legends, and myth, especially with the Lady of the Mists, who appears more as an apparition than the actual terrestrial entity. Then you have these exceptions, even more so to that rule, with Ariel or with Orion, who are living incarnations of Isha and Kurnous respectively. And they have a really cool story behind them that I'll reserve for when we get there. So for this video, I want to touch in on the Kadai, And in the next video, we'll go over the Cytharai. And now that you have this essential background, though, we can talk more with that kind of frame and reference in place. So let's dive right in on the Kadai. Starting, of course, with Asuryan the Creator. And this is the oldest and greatest of all of the elf gods, and lord of the Kadai as well as the heavens. So quite the Game of Thrones series of titles there, you know. Asuryan the Creator, Lord of the Heavens, all these things. But each god has their own rune, which really represents them in the Pantheonic Mandala, which will be displayed with each god as we go through this video here. But no mortal has ever really seen Asuryan. In the Tyrion and Teclis novels, he's represented as kind of an immense presence that kind of pushes against Teclis as he draws power from the Well of Asuryan and the Shrine of Asuryan. And as a result, all the depictions of him are this masked elf in Ulthuan. And as the patron god of the High Elves, his symbology can be found all over the continent, especially on their banner in Total War Warhammer 2 for Eataine, the home of Lothern and the Shrine of Asuryan. The symbol of a flaming phoenix, the Eye of Asuryan, or a flaming flaming pyramid. These are all of what we see as the symbology behind Asuryan. They can be seen everywhere. And at the actual Shrine of Asuryan on the Isle of Flame and the Sea of Dreams on Ulthuan, the Phoenix King is ordained by passing through Asuryan's sacred flame. And this, of course, is the same shrine that we get the Phoenix Guard from. That flame kind of depicts whether or not the prince becomes the Phoenix King. In Malekith's case, it burns him from head to toe, encasing him in the Warhammer equivalent of Darth Vader's suit. I've only just begun. But as you can see, there is a heavy emphasis on Asuryan. He is one of the biggest gods of the Pantheon, with him being the ruler of it, so he rightfully has quite a bit of say across elfdom. And the High Elf Monarch, the Phoenix King, even is named after Asuryan. He has that same title, the Phoenix King. And he's often depicted as this very regal being, resplendent in these beautiful clothes, you know, kind of cloaks of lustrous white feathers, bearing a scepter and wearing a mask, as we've said, which is actually half white and half black, kind of showing his ability to take the center ground and stance on things. So he's Big Daddy, though, you know. So when the other elves have a dispute, he usually adjudicates or issues the final say on what goes down. And Asuryan is married to Lileath, who we'll jump into shortly, but we'll jump into another very important goddess, the daughter of Asuryan, and that's Isha the Mother. And just like Big Daddy Asuryan, Isha is portrayed as this immensely beautiful elf maiden with golden locks of hair, full of life and energy, essentially what all of us pictured our wives would be like when we were growing up, only then to find the love of Warhammer keeping us warm through the cold, cold nights. I mean, wait, what? Moving on, her symbol is that of an eye, and hers to be exact, and it's shedding a single tear for her mortal children, the elves. It's called the All-Seeing Eye, and she is considered to be the mother of the elven race, and these tears are part of Asuryan's kind of decree of saying that elves may not live forever, but they can be pretty damn old. And this plays into the rain that then births new life for Ulthuan and all of elfdom. You know, these tears kind of fall down onto the mortal realm. And we see her blessing being bestowed upon lands such as Averlorn, which never really even gets to see, you know, the touch of winter, as it says in the book. And this is why people call it the land of eternal summer. It is considered the most idyllic paradise in Ulthuan, which we've talked about while going through those elf kingdoms in that Elf Kingdom video. And she is the patron goddess of the harvest, bounty, and fertility, growth in any way, shape, or form, either from the land or from the people. And she taught the elves agriculture, horticulture, and actually how to tend the land. And this expands out further with the wood elves, you know, with their skills fine-tuned with communicating with the forest spirits of Athel Loren or the forest dragons, everything. And farmers and wood elves in general will pray to Isha for a bountiful harvest, forest growth, etc., etc. And as a result, she is one of the two prime deities, the other being her husband Kurnous, who we're going to go to in a second. But I want to get into one big point of contention between the High and Wood Elves. So the High Elves look at the Ever Queen, the High Elf monarchy having the twin thrones of Ulthuan, the Phoenix King under Asuryan, basically not the incarnation, but kind of the voice of Asuryan in the elf or in the mortal world, and then the Ever Queen through Isha. And the High Elves look at her as the incarnation and most beloved of Isha, while the Wood Elves look at Addrele to be the one that holds that honor. And this both keeps the nations on end, but also binds them. They know that the connection to the two through the world roots is still there and strong, but neither's ability to really concede to the other, them being fucking elves and whatnot, keeps them as kind of two separate nations. Well, a number of other facets, but still, that's pretty huge. That huge, spiritual presence, since the Wood Elves rely so heavily on their connection to Isha and Kurnous through Orion and Addrele. Anyway, let's move on here to her husband, Kurnous the Hunter. So if Isha is the mother of the elves, then Kurnous is the father of the elf race, and also very highly venerated, right? He goes by a lot of different names: the God of the Hunt, Lord of Beasts, Spirit of the Untouched Wilderness, Lord of the Wild Places, Father of Elves. The list goes on, really, and most of the elf deities are portrayed as either overly merciful, like Isha, or prone to fits of vengeful wrath, like Kurnous. And his laws are really considered absolute as a result, and no one really dares push on those laws. The mighty God of the Hunt is not a nice man, and like a lot of our mythologies, Kurnous can take on the form of any beast he so wishes, really, and is mainly portrayed as this kind of 10-foot tall humanoid with a stag head and horns, half man, half stag. But as you can guess, his role over the forest is pretty absolute, and this is extremely evident in Addrele the Hidden. Kurnous employs a pretty simple rule, that no hunter hunts more than they absolutely need, and only kill animals for necessity or that are ravening beasts or trying to kill them. So any breakage of these laws would see the wrath of Kurnous brought down on the transgressors. So picture this kind of massive creature loping through the wilderness. Kurnous' sounds his great horn to the braying of his many hounds to signal the beginning of the great hunt, because it talks a lot about the hounds of Kurnous, and we even see that as an ability under Orion. So, like Isha, though, like Isha has an incarnate in Addrele, or the Everqueen, we have the King of Addrele the Hidden, Orion, as we just mentioned, the Mel Gibson himself, leading the Wood Elves as Kurnous' incarnate. So the elf kingdom of Illyrian as well primarily worships Kurnous outside of Addrele the Hidden. That's not the only place that elves worship Kurnous, with their shrine and priesthood being dedicated to the Lord of Beasts, just like it would be in Addrele the Hidden. So we talked about some of these gods sharing similarities with the old world's pantheon, and Kurnous really shares a lot of similarities with Tal, who we'll go over in that respective video with the human pantheon, but I want to stick to the elves for now. So now that we've got that covered, the wild master of the woods, we can cut into a more reserved god, that is Hoeth, the Lord of Wisdom. So while important, Hoeth does not have the same kind of following as the previous three gods that we've discussed. Hoeth is the patron god of knowledge, wisdom, magic, and other scholarly pursuits. So before the elf SATs, all of the aspiring elf lore masters pray to Hoeth for guidance through tough problems. But they meditate really on the many quandaries of the world and on magical enchantments. That's kind of Hoeth's playground as it is. And many of the great rituals that the elves partake in are at first started with an utterance of prayer to Hoeth. In fact, the White Tower of Hoeth, his namesake, is really the only place that Hoeth is venerated, though. I mean, he doesn't have the priesthoods and followers of the other gods, even though he's deeply important to an entire caste of the elven society. That society not being particularly secular or anything of the sort, really. They're just as religious as anyone else in the elf world. And he is often depicted as an elderly elf in the robes of a lore master, and very simple depiction of an immensely intelligent god. So it's kind of a nice almost irony to it. And the White Tower itself is then protected by, and this is a unit that we're going to see in Total War Warhammer 2, is the Sword Masters of Hoeth. And these guys, their faith in Hoeth is ultimately very different than the conventional lore master of Hoeth. The aspiring lore masters who approach the White Tower to become the masters of high magic pray for guidance and knowledge. The sword masters, on the other hand, meditate and think upon Hoeth, almost like high elf Jedis, right? Almost like kind of like samurai. They use this focus to help hone their sword arm and martial prowess. So either way, it was Hoeth who gifted the elves with the knowledge that they have to this day, and that knowledge extends outside of the world of the arcane and into some other pursuits, and some of those other pursuits are looked over by some other gods. Those other pursuits kind of lending over to Vaul the Maker. Vaul is the great elven god of smiths, armorers, artisans, craftsmanship, and essentially really just working with your damn hands. In fact, glade guards only craft their own arrows with the prayers of Vaul in mind as they craft their arrowheads, inscribing each one with the tears of Vaul in Elvish written on it, on each single one of them. The elves are, very histrionic people. But Vaul's past is riddled with a lot of rivalry and bitterness. During the War of the Gods, the ancient War of the Gods, Vaul challenged Cain to single combat. Well, that turned out about as well as you can imagine for a god solely dedicated to blood, murder, and combat. So Cain won and blinded and crippled Vaul and bound him into his service. And this really in no way lessened his crafting abilities, but he now does so in kind of this reverent silence is what it talks about, his shame kind of damning him to silence. And he crafts the very armor and weapons of the hosts of heaven, as well as instilling this in elfdom. I mean, Cain then commands Vaul to create the 8 rings of Cain. And bear with me here, this can kind of get a little bit confusing in the same way that most mythologies can, but try and hang tight here. So creates the 8 rings of Cain to bind the winds of magic, to which Hecate, the goddess of dark magic, who we'll get into, was pretty bitter about, as she's the one who creates the winds of magic. So they conspire with Astarte, the goddess of pleasure, and she is convinced by Vaul and Hecate to seduce Cain and get the rings. And she fails, but in the ensuing struggle, the rings fall to the mortal realm, and the Ring of Fury is the only one that's really kind of recovered by the mortals and in the hands of the High Elves itself. It is actually a magic item in one of the army books for the High Elves, so it's kind of a nice little way for the lore to tie into some of their own enchanted items. But why does that always happen? Do the gods have a bunch of precipices that lead right to the mortal realm? Oh god damn it, that was my one good shoe again. Anyway, I digress. Vaul is also the guy who is responsible for making the Widowmaker and the sword that Anarion draws from the Blighted Isle, the dreaded sword of Cain that drew from Anarion and actually changed his whole entire outlook. He became more of a bitter and darker and colder elf at that point. But it is said that the flames of Draugr, the father of dragons, were used to help temper the metal that made up that blade. And Vaul is then depicted almost like Hephaestus from Greek mythology, a crippled and blind blacksmith of skill without peer. That's kind of Hephaestus' claim to fame. But Vaul's primary shrines are all called the Vaul's Anvil. And we see one of them during the flyover video. It starts on top of what looks like a volcano. And there's one in Clarkharan and another one in Torgovan in Athol Loran. So since we're on the subject of Torgovan, we'll have to talk about Lord Daith. And he is really seen as possibly being the mortal representation, I guess you could say. It's not necessarily an incarnate, but it doesn't describe him as an incarnate in the book. But he's multiple millennia old and said to be the smith of the very armor of Anarion. So he's 4 millennia old, I think it was. So it's insanely old, even for an elf. He's probably amongst one of the first elf colonists to land in the old world. So that's pretty damn old. But that kind of ties up Vaul here, and we'll jump into a little bit different of a god, and one who is, although he has a Kadai, he kind of has a little bit more of a darker stream in him, and that is Loec, the Shadow Dancer, and the patron god of trickery, music, and revelry. Like I said, though, he does have a dark side, and he's also the god of shadows, vengeance, and dark deeds. So Loec's primary function is both distracting and tricking the chaos god Slaanesh. So when elves die, Slaanesh kind of hunts for their souls and devours them before they can actually even reach the elven afterlife. And in the afterlife, though, they become slaves regardless. But better a slave in the elven afterlife than a tasty morsel for Slaanesh's palate. So Loec does not do this all the time. So it's not like he's just cavorting to and fro, distracting Slaanesh so that the elves can get to the afterlife. This drains him with each kind of endeavor, each foray into distracting Slaanesh. But once he can really summon up the strength to do so, he beguiles and tricks Slaanesh, allowing souls to enter that said afterlife. And he often appears as a dancing elf boy, dancing across the night sky. And he, being the patron of revelry, really brings life and laughter to the Elf Pantheon. So there's this cool saying in the book that says, let me see here, the heavens would grow dull and cold, but the stars of the night sky would no longer have reason to remain wakeful. So as part of his darker side, though, the Shadow Warriors of Nagarath worship him chiefly in Ulthuan, pledging their vengeance in his name with each exacting kill upon their dark kin. And there's actually a nifty little blurb in the Wood Elf Army books that discuss the Shadow Dancers, who are obviously dedicated to Loec. It's in their damn name. But the dragons in the Warhammer world are sentient, intelligent, and quite clever beings. They're not silent beasts. They do not converse with they do converse with the living. They if they deem them worthy, though, because they're very prideful beasts. So them being dragons are quite haughty. So dragons like to give a bit of a bow to Loec, though, for saving elf souls from Slaanesh. They also like to think he learned this from Draupnir, the aforementioned father of dragons. So dragons being dragons, they always kind of have to have that final, but we did it. Shadow Dancers, on the other hand, say it was the opposite. Say it was that Loec taught Draupnir how to be kind of clever and wily. So the two tend to get in these kind of battles of the wits, which is a fun little blurb I was talking about from the Wood Elf Army book. So with Athel Loran in mind, let's finish off the Kadai with the last two goddesses, starting with the wife of Asuryan, Lileath the Maiden. So here we have the true Lady of the Lake. This is the same one that Bretonnians worship and admire. Lileath is the goddess of dreams, prophecy, and fortune. And she is portrayed like her daughter as a beautiful elf maiden with these white angelic wings that sprout from her back. And she's atop this celestial steed named Cindermane, known as it trots clippity-clop across the night sky. But the elf seers pray to her to give them visions of the future, but what she is really most known for are her blessings of Lileath, to the elves at least. She makes Bretonnia kind of her mortal realm, and she imparts some of her power and some of her fervor into the Bretonnians, and that's how you get Grail Knights, and that's how you get damsels and prophetesses. That's how they get they kind of channel their magic from her. Well, not directly from it, it's from the winds of magic itself, but she imbues them with a little bit of her stuff. But the blessings of Lileath, these are the three gifts given to the elves with special powers, more or less. You've got the Star Crown, which is a crown that grants the bearer visions of all time and places that the gods themselves can see. So anything the gods can see, the bearer of this can see as well. And it was unfortunately shattered during the Sundering. So it was lost many millennia ago. And the amulet of Sunfire was sort of like the light of Evenstar in Lord of the Rings, a light in the dark places when all other lights have gone out. The book describes it as bringing hope to those in despair and fury to evil creatures. So I think the amulet of Sunfire was lost by, it's during Morvain, I believe his name is, the Phoenix King Morvain, from someone who, the wearer of it was lost during a freak storm, and the ship was lost itself at sea, so the amulet with it. But the last item here, the Moon Staff of Lileath, and this staff now resides in the use of Teclis and is actually filled with a great deal of Lileath's own power. In the tabletop, this aids Teclis in casting spells with his power dice, so I'm looking forward to the translation in Total War Warhammer 2 on how that'll work. Maybe it's a Winds of Magic regen, who knows. But in the lore, Teclis uses the Moonstaff of Lileath to kind of imbue his ravaged body with strength to kind of keep going. Teclis is kind of sickly in the earlier portions of his lore until he learns alchemy and learns more magic to fill his body with some vitality and some strength. But let's button things up here with the last goddess and deity of the Kadai, Addrele, the Lady of the Mists. And this is the patron goddess and protector of all things hidden or lost. And this would, of course, include travelers in the wilderness. But there's not really a ton on Addrele, and it's kind of sad because we're kind of ending on a lower note. But a lot of the portions of elf society that find themselves on ships tend to worship her chiefly. So you're looking at Lothern or Ivris or even Kothic maybe. But where elves tend to go on grand adventures, there's a lot of shrines to Addrele. And she's depicted as this veiled elf maiden. And as a result, she kind of has the mythology that she's actually the most beautiful of all elf goddesses because, hey, we haven't seen her, so she must be the most beautiful. There's also another kind of portion to that myth that says, hey, yeah, no, she's beautiful, but it's not her, it's someone else. It's a different person in a different guise, or a different elf deity at least. But that really covers all the gods and goddesses of the Kadai, the heavens of the Elf Pantheon. And in the next video, we'll be covering the Cytharai and the gods in there and which elves chiefly worship them, just like we kind of did here, guys. So there's quite a few of those, more so than the Kadai. So we will probably break that into 2 videos. But hopefully this will start to flesh out a lot of the Elf Pantheon for you guys and give you an idea of how worship actually works in the elf society. It's not a monotheistic culture, and it's extremely polytheistic, and it's like the Greeks, Romans, Norse, and Egyptian pantheons with gods dedicated to certain acts or actions. And with that, we kind of get these elves that favor her more so than others. Like, you've got the Shadow Dancers of Loec, or you've got the Phoenix Guard, who are going to chiefly look at Asuryan for guidance and for prayers. So it's very interesting to see how each one of these influences and guides portions of the elf society, and even some of their units that we're going to see in Total War Warhammer 2. The Lord Sword Masters of Hoeth, all going through Hoeth. It doesn't necessarily directly say this, but it would make sense to me that Kurnous would find some sort of guidance with the White Lions, and it does with the Illyrian Reavers because they all hail from Illyrian. So there's always some aspect of their pantheon imbued into their units, and that is true with the High Elves as well as it will be for the Dark Elves when we talk about Cytharai. But thanks for watching here today, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this. We got quite a bit covered here, but there's going to be even more to cover with the next portion of the Pantheon, as well as the Dwarf Pantheon, the Empire Pantheon. We'll go into Hashut, the Chaos Dwarf God. We've got plenty more planned for you guys. But thanks for watching. Have a good one. Take care.